What if the oldest records on Earth weren't telling us how humanity began, but how it almost ended? What if the clay tablets, star charts, and temple inscriptions stretching back 6,000 years weren't harmless myths at all, but fragments of a warning left behind by people who watched their world drown? From the crumbling cities of southern Iraq to the sand-choked temples of Egypt, from Turkey's sunburned highlands to the frozen memory buried in Greenland's ice, echoes of that forgotten world are still here. Every carved symbol, every impossible king list, every obsessive note about the sky. All of it feels less like storytelling and more like someone trying very hard not to let something be forgotten. Right now, that story is scattered and half buried, sleeping under layers of dust and silence, waiting for someone curious enough to piece it back together before we sink deeper into it. Take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're drawn to the weird edge of history, the place where fact, speculation, and forgotten memories start to blur together. And since you're still here, drop a comment and tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? I like to imagine this vanished world reaching out across oceans and time zones. It's ghosts sitting beside you tonight while we talk about it. Because our story doesn't begin with answers. It begins with dust. In the late 19th century, European archaeologists marched out into the plains of ancient Mesopotamia. Near the ruins of Uruk and Eridu, the ground beneath their boots had been baking under the Iraqi sun for thousands of years. To them, it was just hard-packed clay, dead land, until they started digging. What they uncovered were tablets, thousands of them, stacked in layers, packed into rooms like shells in a library turned to stone. Each one covered in tiny wedge marks pressed into wet clay, then baked solid. These were the records of the people we call the Sumerians. And from the moment scholars began to read them, something in our tidy timeline of human history twisted. Because what appeared on those tablets wasn't the clumsy handwriting of a culture just learning how to write. It was already systematic, organized, technically precise. The earliest Sumerian records show up around 3500 BC, and they don't look like the beginning of a writing system. There's no scribble phase, no obvious, we're still figuring this out stage. Cuneiform isn't just some random scratching on clay. From its first appearance, it's geometric, structured, and capable of recording everything from taxes and trade to laws and star charts. Their cities show the same thing, laid out with careful planning. Canals engineered with real understanding of water flow, ziggurats aligned to the cardinal directions, and key points on the horizon. Their astronomical records, somehow tracking Venus, Jupiter, and Mars with a level of accuracy that wouldn't be confirmed again until humans invented telescopes thousands of years later. It's like somebody walked into a dark room, flipped on the light, and instead of scattered stone huts and a few confused farmers, there's an entire civilization already sitting there, writing, counting, mapping the sky, and arguing about property lines. Historians prefer a slow climb, one discovery leading to another, crude tools becoming better tools, oral traditions slowly becoming written language. But Sumer doesn't behave like that. Sumer hits the stage fully dressed. Here's where it gets stranger. The Sumerians themselves never claimed to be the first. In their own records, they talk about knowledge that was given back to them. They describe a time before kingship, before the flood, a time when wisdom descended from heaven, carried by beings they call the Apkallu, the seven sages, who emerged from the waters after a great catastrophe and taught humanity how to rebuild. Modern scholars wrap this in the soft blanket of mythology, but the pattern doesn't stop in Mesopotamia. Egyptian priests wrote about Zep Tepi, the first time, an age of divine rule that came before the pharaohs, before the dynasties we know. Ancient Hindu texts talk about long world ages, yugas, stretching tens of thousands of years, ending in catastrophic floods and resets. The Maya carved stories of multiple creations and destructions. Hebrew tradition remembers a world before the flood. Greek myths speak of earlier races of humans wiped away. Chinese, Mesopotamian, Native American, Polynesian traditions. Again and again, you see the same pattern. An advanced age, a catastrophe, a deluge, a restart. Cultures separated by continents, oceans, and thousands of years are all describing the same basic sequence. So we have to ask, Is that just a really popular narrative template humans invented independently again and again? Or were they all remembering the same thing through different languages and symbols? As archaeologists dug deeper, they expected to find a clumsy phase underneath the polished surface of early civilizations. You know, simpler settlements, rougher tools, trial and error attempts at architecture. Instead, they kept finding more sophistication. Underneath Sumerian cities like Uruk, they hit older cultures, the Ubaid period, settlements dating back to 5400 BC with organized irrigation, clear social structures, and temple platforms. Not random huts, not scattered tents, but early versions of the same kind of organized life that would later explode into full-fledged city-states. In Egypt, erosion patterns on the Great Sphinx and nearby structures suggest they were exposed to rain serious, sustained rainfall in a climate that has been desert for roughly 5,000 years, which implies those structures might be far older than the dynasties we attribute them to. In Turkey, at a site called Göbekli Tepe, they unearthed a megalithic temple complex built around 9600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago. It was constructed by people who, according to traditional history, were still supposed to be wandering around as basic hunter-gatherers. No cities, no writing, no agriculture. And yet, they carved multi-ton stone pillars, arranged them in circles, decorated them with intricate animal reliefs and symbols, built architecture with astronomical alignments. Then, after centuries of use, they buried it on purpose, filled it in, covered it up. It's like finding a cathedral under a campsite. Everywhere we dig, the same thing happens. The deeper we go, the older it gets. The older it gets, the more the story refuses to look primitive. In the Louvre Museum in Paris, there's a small clay cylinder behind glass. You could walk right past it and never notice. Its inscription describes the construction of a temple to Inanna, goddess of the heavens. Buried in the dedication lines is a quiet bomb. This is built according to the writings from before the flood. Not, this is the first temple. Not, we invented this design. But we are following older instructions. It's an admission. Even the Sumerians, the people we like to call the first civilization, saw themselves as heirs, not pioneers, not inventors, heirs to something older, something they felt but no longer fully understood. If you look closely at some of these artifacts under museum light, you can sometimes see fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried, the thumbprint of a scribe who lived 6,000 years ago. You can almost imagine that person, sitting in a dim room, copying an older tablet, carefully pressing each wedge-shaped mark into wet clay, not to create something new, but to preserve something ancient, not inventing, remembering, and the silence around it, the gaps, the missing pages, almost feels louder than the words, like a sentence trailing off mid-thought, like a name on the tip of your tongue that never quite comes back. Maybe that's why these records still pull at us, because deep down, they feel less like the first chapter of a book and more like the last few surviving pages of a much longer story. Late at night, when the museums are closed and the lights are low, I like to imagine those tablets sitting in the dark, still holding their secrets. Each one a tiny time capsule. Each one carrying a fragment of a world that ended. We stand here, 6,000 years later, calling this the beginning of civilization. But what if it isn't? What if what we call history is only the part that made it through the fire? What if we're not at the beginning of understanding, but at the end of remembrance? And if the Sumerians were right, if their knowledge really came from before the flood, then we have asked a question that changes everything. What kind of world existed before theirs? And why does every ancient record that dares to remember it describe it the same way? If the Sumerians really were inheriting knowledge from before the flood, then we're forced into a question most history books quietly avoid. What kind of world existed before theirs? And why do so many ancient records remember it in almost the exact same way? To find that answer, we don't start with myths. We start with mud. In 1922, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley was digging through the ruins of ancient Ur, one of Sumer's great cities. At first, it was a usual archaeological chaos. broken pottery, collapsed walls, fragments of everyday life stacked layer upon layer. Then, about 11 feet down, his shovel hit something different. A band of pure silt, 8 feet thick, clean, sterile, no artifacts, no bones, no trash, just fine, water-laid mud. That kind of layer doesn't come from a normal seasonal flood. It's not a river rising and retreating like it does every year. This is a signature of a massive inundation, a flood so severe it wiped the slate clean before people came back and built on top of it. And that's exactly what Woolley found. Below the flood layer, the remains of an older settlement, different pottery, different structures, a whole earlier phase of life. Above the layer, the city of Ur that we know from Sumerian records. Then he looked at the Sumerian tablets that described their own past. They said, after the flood swept over, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an Eridu, not once upon a time, not a vague poetic scene, a specific sequence. There was a flood. After the flood, kingship, civilization, order, structure appeared again. The first post-flood city was Eridu. Woolley had literally dug to the line in their history, where they said everything changed. And Ur wasn't the only place with that scar. Archaeologists found the same flood layer at Kish, at Shuruppak, at other Mesopotamian sites. Different cities. Same band of water-laid mud. Same rough time window. Around 2900 to 3500 BC. It's as if someone hit reset on the entire region. The Sumerians described a world-ending flood that separated before from after. The ground beneath their cities says the same thing. Meanwhile, over in Egypt, a different kind of time bomb was carved into stone. French archaeologist Auguste Mariette uncovered the Abydos king list in the Temple of Seti I. It's basically a carved timeline, a list of kings one after another, going back through Egyptian history. At first you see the usual suspects, Ramses, Seti, Thutmose, all the familiar pharaohs. Then the list keeps going, back past the First Dynasty, back into a section labeled Zep Tepi, the first time. According to the inscriptions, before human pharaohs, Egypt was ruled by the Nedjru, divine beings, who reigned for thousands of years. Later, the Turin Papyrus turned up another ancient Egyptian king list, this time written on papyrus instead of carved in stone. It repeats the same idea, but with numbers. Pre-dynastic rulers with reigns lasting hundreds, even thousands of years. Modern scholars shrugged and said, myth, priestly propaganda, symbolic time. But then geology walked in and said, are you sure? Because Egypt's oldest monuments began telling a different story. The Great Sphinx, the Valley Temple, massive blocks of limestone around Giza. Independent geologists looked at the erosion patterns and pointed out something awkward. This isn't wind erosion. It looks like heavy rainfall, the kind you get in a wet, humid climate. But Egypt has been dry desert for at least 5,000 years. So either the Sphinx and parts of the Giza Plateau are older than we think, and one stood in a completely different climate, or every geologist who's worked on this is wildly wrong, and the weather just got experimental for a bit. Either way, it supports the same unsettling idea. Egyptian civilization might be sitting on top of something older than itself. Then Turkey stepped into the conversation with a sledgehammer. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt started excavating a hill locals in southeastern Turkey called Potbelly Hill, Göbekli Tepe. What he uncovered broke the timeline in half. Stone circles, massive T-shaped pillars up to 20 tons each, intricate carvings of animals, foxes, lions, birds, scorpions, mixed with abstract symbols. No houses, no trash pits, no signs of everyday life. This wasn't a village. It was a temple complex. And the date? Around 9600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago. To put that in perspective, 6,000 years before Sumer, 7,000 years before the pyramids, at a time when we're told humans were just barely figuring out farming. Yet someone organized huge teams, quarried and carved stone, transported it, set upright, and built a site with clear planning and astronomical hints baked into the layout. Then, After maybe 1,000 to 1,500 years of use, they did something really strange. They buried it. Carefully, deliberately, they filled the entire site in with rubble and earth, almost like sealing a time capsule. It's as if they knew something was coming, or knew they were going, and wanted this place preserved for a future they'd never see. While all of that was happening in the ground, another record of the past was quietly forming in ice. In Greenland and Antarctica, layers of compacted snow turned into ice, trapping tiny bubbles of air, little samples of the atmosphere from thousands of years ago. In the 1960s and 70s, scientists drilled down and began reading those layers like pages in a frozen book. What they found around 12,000 BC was violent. Temperatures didn't shift gently. They spiked and plunged. Within decades, global temperatures jumped by as much as 8 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That's insanely fast on a planetary scale. The Ice Age didn't slowly pack its bags and leave. It slammed the door on its way out. Sea levels surged. Glaciers melted at terrifying speed. Geologists gave one phase of this chaos a name: Meltwater Pulse 1A. Between about 12,000 and 11,500 BC, sea levels rose roughly 20 meters, around 65 feet, in just a few centuries. Then later, Meltwater Pulse 1B hit, raising seas even further. Add it all together, and between 12,000 and 6,000 BC, global sea level rose by over 120 meters, more than 400 feet. Think about that. Any coastal city, port, or settlement from before that time, gone, not eroded, not abandoned, physically under hundreds of feet of ocean now. And since most humans throughout history have lived within about 50 miles of a coast, that means if there was a complex coastal civilization before the flood stories, most of its ruins would now be underwater, out on the continental shelves, where we barely started to look. The ground agrees, the ice agrees, the sea agrees, and the stories? They've been telling us the same thing the whole time. Everywhere you look, ancient cultures remember a flood, not just some local river overflowing, but a world-ending event. Sumer remembers a flood before kingship returned. The Hebrews tell of Noah. The Akkadians tell of Utnapishtim. India remembers Manu. Greece remembers Deucalion and Pyrrha. China remembers Gun and you taming the great waters. The Maya, Aztec, Hopi, and countless other indigenous cultures remember worlds destroyed by water. These aren't just flood tales. They're stories of reset, an advanced age, a catastrophe, a wipeout, a handful of survivors, a broken world that is to start again. The 6,000-year record we call the beginning of civilization doesn't read like a first attempt. It reads like a rebuild. Sumer wasn't inventing writing, astronomy, law, and city planning from zero. Egypt wasn't just trying out megalithic stonework and hieroglyphs for the first time. Göbekli Tepe wasn't a weird one-off coincidence. All of it looks less like humanity's first steps, and more like the first steps after a fall. If that's true, if these early civilizations were rebuilding instead of starting fresh, then the next question is unavoidable. What exactly were they trying to recreate? And how much of that world is still hiding under our feet in our myths and beneath 400 feet of salt water? The truth should have been visible in the ruins themselves. Not in the stories, not in the myths, but in the stone and the broken pottery, and the way cities slowly get better at being cities. Because every civilization is supposed to have a childhood. You expect to see it in the dirt. Rough first attempt before the masterpieces. Clumsy irrigation ditches before engineered canal systems. Simple shrines before towering temples. Improvised rules before formal law. A slow climb from "we're figuring this out" to "we've got this." But when researchers really started looking at the earliest cities, that childhood was missing. There was no awkward phase. Take Sumer. By the time their cities appear clearly in the record around 3500 BC, they arrive with irrigation already dialed in. Not just a few muddy ditches to guide river water. We're talking complex canal networks, flow regulators, drainage systems, managed water levels for fields and cities, all carefully engineered to control two wild rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, and sustain populations in the tens of thousands. That kind of system requires geometry, surveying, hydraulic knowledge, and generations of trial and error. But in the archaeological layers beneath, we don't see the trial and error part. Their cities also didn't grow like random clusters of mud huts. The urban layout shows planning, streets, temple districts, administrative zones. Their ziggurats aren't just big piles of bricks. They're aligned to cardinal directions, built in specific ratios, with internal passages and drainage built in. And legally, by 2100 BC, the Code of Ur-Nammu appears, one of the oldest surviving law codes. It's not, don't hit each other, don't steal. It's proportional punishments, financial compensation for injury, protections for widows and orphans, clear categories of responsibility. This reads like a legal system that has already lived through centuries of disputes, injustices, reforms, and hard lessons, now finally written down. That's not a first draft of civilization. That's a patch notes update. Their medicine tells the same story. Sumerian and later Babylonian tablets talk about diagnosis categories, symptoms and outcomes, herbal mixtures with measured quantities, procedures for injuries and infections. And in Egypt, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text copy from much older sources, walks through 48 surgical cases, fractures, wounds, spinal injuries, head trauma. It describes what the doctor should look for, how to test responses, and whether a case is treatable, uncertain, or untreatable. That's not folk magic. That's clinical thinking. So here's the problem. All of this, law, medicine, engineering, astronomy, shows up fast. Too fast. It doesn't look like humanity slowly inching toward complexity. It looks like someone picking up a broken system and trying to restore it. Archaeologists assume the missing early chapters of this story must lie in the cultures that came right before Sumer. So they dug deeper, back into what's called the Ubaid period, and things got even weirder. The Ubaid culture, flourishing from around 6500 to 3800 BC, already had organized villages with clear layouts, temple platforms, pottery kilns, evidence of long-distance trade, from the Persian Gulf up into Anatolia. These people weren't just figuring out how to farm. They were running trade networks, maintaining religious centers, and managing water long before Sumer's official appearance. The deeper they dug, the more it felt like Sumer wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the inheritance. The same pattern pops up in South Asia. In the 1970s, at a site called Mehrgarh in modern-day Pakistan, archaeologists found something that shouldn't exist at 7000 BC. Evidence of dentistry, actual drilled teeth, fine bow drill holes in human molars, clearly made while the person was alive, likely to treat decay. Alongside that, Mehrgarh had planned mud brick architecture, granaries for long-term storage, trade beads made from materials sourced hundreds of miles away, signs of selective breeding in both plants and animals. This isn't we just started planting seeds and seeing what happens. It's systematic agriculture and medicine in one of the earliest Neolithic settlements. Again, where's a messy learning curve? Then there's Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, around 7500 BC. When you hear Neolithic town, you probably imagine scattered huts and simple life. But Çatalhöyük housed up to 8,000 people in a dense, interconnected honeycomb of mud brick houses. No streets, no alleys. People walked over the roofs and entered their homes through holes in the ceiling, climbing down interior ladders. The entire city was basically a single, continuous structure. Inside, the walls were painted with elaborate murals, hunting scenes, geometric shapes, vultures, bulls. They had obsidian mirrors, textile weaving, organized burial practices, shared shrines and ritual spaces. Again, this is 7500 BC. You're not looking at a society learning to be settled. You're looking at a society that already understands the costs and benefits of dense urban life. And when archaeologists looked not in the soil, but under the sea, the pattern got even harder to ignore. Off the coast of India, sonar scans near the Gulf of Khumbat revealed geometric structures over 100 feet underwater. Straight lines, right angles, what looked like foundations and platforms. If those structures were built when sea levels were lower and then drowned as the oceans rose, they would date back to at least 700 BC, possibly earlier. Off Yonaguni in Japan, divers found massive step-like rock formations that some argue are natural, others argue are carved. Terraces, straight edges, what appear to be platforms and stairs, now all submerged at depths that would have been dry land during the last ice age. In the Mediterranean, whole settlements now lie underwater. At Lityam off Israel's coast, Pavla Petri near Greece, submerged structures off Malta predating the island's megalithic temples. And in the North Sea, there was once a landmass connecting Britain to mainland Europe called Doggerland, a huge coastal plain with rivers, lakes, animals, and likely human settlements. Today, it's all underwater. Fishing trawlers sometimes pull up stone tools and animal bones from what is now seafloor. The same story repeats in Southeast Asia with the drowned Sunda Shelf, and between Australia and New Guinea, where a land bridge is now the Torres Strait. Everywhere you look, the youngest coastlines of today sit on top of drowned landscapes where older worlds once stood. And we've barely started exploring them. The deeper and farther archaeologists looked, the more they kept finding the same contradiction. Complexity where simplicity should be. But Egypt is where that contradiction hits hardest. When we meet Egypt officially around 3100 BC with the first dynasties, we're told this is the start of one of history's greatest civilizations. Yet their earliest stonework and writing already look like the work of experts. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara, built for Pharaoh Djoser around 2700 BC, isn't some clumsy prototype. It's a multi-level stone structure designed by Imhotep with deep underground chambers, courtyards, colonnades, careful engineering at a monumental scale. Hieroglyphic writing appears around the same time, and again, it arrives complete. Hundreds of distinct signs, phonetic and symbolic elements working together. Grammar already in place. Used from the start on grave goods, labels, temple inscriptions, and administrative records. There's no obvious proto-hieroglyph system that slowly evolves into the real thing. It just appears ready for full-scale use. And the priests didn't pretend they'd invented any of it. They kept saying the quiet part out loud. At temples like Abydos and Dendera, inscriptions claim that their temples were built as restorations. The plans came from the first time. They were following layouts from the age of the gods, not designing from scratch. Copying, preserving, restoring. None of these first civilizations behave like beginners. Sumer doesn't act like a culture figuring out writing, math, and irrigation for the first time. Egypt doesn't act like it's just now discovering megalithic engineering and formal language. Murgar, Catalhoyuk, the Abaid towns, the submerged cities, they don't look like humanity's training wheels. They look like continuations. Rebuilds, ports of an older program onto newer hardware. Sumer didn't invent astronomy and law. It remembered them. Egypt didn't discover stone architecture and symbolic writing from nothing. It retrieved them. Neolithic sites didn't accidentally stumble into complex planning. They were carrying forward a mindset that already knew what complexity could look like. So if these early societies were inheriting instead of inventing, if the first written languages appear fully grown, if the temples say, over and over, we are copying from plans given long ago, then where did those plans come from? Who first mapped the stars? Who first laid out the sacred geometry? Who first wrote the words that later scribes were desperately trying to reconstruct from memory, myth, and fragmentary tradition? Their own records tell us. They did describe the world that came before. They did tell us who ruled it, how long it lasted, and how it ended. We just decided not to take them seriously. So what did those early civilizations actually say about the world before theirs? They didn't hide it in riddles. They wrote it down as plainly as they knew how. In Sumer, scribes compiled something we now call the Sumerian king list around 2100 BC. They didn't treat it like a myth. They treated it like a historical record. Names, cities, durations, all laid out in order. And the very first line punches straight through our comfortable view of history. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was an Eridu, not once upon a time, not in the days of the gods, but kingship descended. authority, order, civilization. Came down. Then it lists the rulers. Alulum of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alaugr of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibera, 43,200 years. 8 kings before the flood. Their combined reigns totaled 241,200 years. Then the tablet says very calmly, then the flood swept over. And after that, the tone shifts. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended once more from heaven. The kingship was in Kish. Reign lengths shrink. Still long at first, hundreds, then dozens of years, but they steadily move towards something human. By the time we get to someone like Gilgamesh, the numbers are closer to myth-soaked memory than cosmic timescales. Modern scholars take one look at those pre-flood reigns and say, okay, obviously that's symbolic. And sure, maybe the numbers are meant to be literal birthdays and candles on cakes. But here's the thing. Egypt tells the same story. Far from Mesopotamia, in the temple of Seti I at Abydos, there's another king list carved into stone. It walks backward in time. Ramses Thutmose, the famous pharaohs we all know from documentaries. And then it just keeps going, back past the First Dynasty, past Narmer, the supposed unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt, back into an era labeled Zep Tepi, the first time. According to Egyptian tradition, this was when the Netjeru, the gods, ruled. Later sources like the Turin Papyrus list these pre-dynastic rulers with reigns lasting hundreds or thousands of years. After them came the followers of Horus, semi-divine kings. Only after that do human pharaohs appear with lifespans we recognize. Again, unbelievably long lifetimes before catastrophe. Gradual shortening after. India has its version too. Hindu texts describe vast ages called yugas, cycles of time where the world moves from golden ages toward darker ones. One complete cycle, a Mahayuga, spans millions of years, but what matters for our purposes is the pattern. Early ages. Lifespans are enormous, knowledge is pure, virtue is high. Later ages. Lives shorten, memory fades, chaos increases. At the end of the cycle comes upheaval, flood, fire, destruction. Then it all starts again. The Maya preserve something eerily similar. Their cosmology doesn't say, this is the first world. It says we're living in the fourth or fifth. Previous worlds ended in jaguars, fire, wind, and flood. The Aztec, the Hopi, the Norse, the Chinese. So many traditions, separated by oceans and millennia, all talking about past worlds, lost ages, and resets. Even the Hebrew Bible slips into that pattern. Before the flood, Genesis lists patriarchs living absurdly long lives. Adam, 930 years. Methuselah, 969 years. Then comes the deluge. After that, lifespans plummet. 175 for Abraham, 120 for Moses, and they keep drifting downward until they settle somewhere near the human range we know. Same template, long ages before, flood in the middle, short ages after. If this were just one culture, we could shrug and say, well, that's mythology for you. But it isn't just one. It's Sumer, Egypt, India, Mesoamerica, the Levant, even Northern Europe, all preserving some version of a long, strange, older world, a cataclysm, a shortened, diminished aftermath. And the part everyone quietly slides past is that these texts don't present that older world as fantasy. They present it as history. Anthropologists once tried to explain this away with a comforting idea. Convergent mythology. The story goes like this. Every culture experiences storms, floods, and transitions. So it's only natural that every culture invents flood myths and golden age legends independently. Similar experiences, similar stories. No shared memory required. But when you actually read the oldest versions of these stories, that explanation starts to wobble, because they don't just talk about big floods. They talk about civilizations wiped out, knowledge being preserved by a tiny remnant, sages or gods passing on instructions for rebuilding, a distinct before where things worked differently. The Sumerian Eridu Genesis, the Akkadian story of Utnapishtim, the Hebrew story of Noah, the Hindu story of Manu, the Greek story of Deucalion. The Chinese story gun and you, these aren't just, wow. It rained a lot that one year. They're about the world's operating system getting wiped and reinstalled. Cities destroyed. Land reshaped. Lifeways gone. And in each version, one family or small group survives with knowledge, not just animals or food, but blueprints for how to live, how to build, how to worship, how to count time. That sounds less like random river flooding, and more like historical trauma, a memory, retold enough times, dressed in symbols and gods, but still carrying the outline of something that actually happened. For a long time, that's all it could be, a hunch, an uncomfortable feeling that the myths and king lists and divine ages might be shadows cast by real events. Then geology caught up. In the 1960s, scientists started drilling deep into the ice of Greenland and Antarctica. Each layer of that ice is basically a year in the planet's diary. Trapped air bubbles, ash, dust, temperature clues. When they reached the layers corresponding to around 12,000 BC, the record went wild. Temperatures jumped. Fast. Not over thousands of years. Over decades. The ice showed a sharp warming spike, marking the end of the last ice age. At roughly the same time, sea levels begin surging upward. Glaciers melt. Oceans rise by tens of meters across just a few centuries. Geologists gave this event a neat name, Meltwater Pulse 1A. But from the ground, from the level of villages and riverbanks and coastal plains, it wouldn't have felt like a technical term. It would have felt like the world is drowning. Then, just when things started to stabilize, the climate whiplashed again. Around 10,800 BC, temperatures plunged back down. A 1,000-year cold snap we now call the Younger Dryas. Species that survived multiple ice ages, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, vanished from the fossil record in a relatively tight window. Human cultures tied to those ecosystems, like the Clovis in North America, also disappear. Not slowly. Abruptly, the planet had hit some kind of turbulence. Rapid warming, sudden cooling, floods, extinctions, rising seas swallowing entire continents' worth of coastal land. Between 12,000 and 6,000 BC, global sea level climbed more than 400 feet. Everything that existed on those shorelines, villages, camps, ports, possible cities, myth or no myth, is now on the continental shelf, deep underwater, wrapped in mud and silence. And right as that geological chaos settled, right as the seas stopped climbing, the ice retreated and the climate calmed down, writing appears, cities appear, temples appear, king lists appear, flood stories get written down. In other words, memory finally gets a permanent home, long after the events themselves. The myths and timelines and divine ages we like to file under religious imagination line up suspiciously well with what the planet's own ice and rock are saying. One side calls it the Great Flood. The other calls it Meltwater Pulse 1A and the Younger Dryas. Same window. Same chaos. The ancients told us a world ended before ours began. The Earth, in its own slow, unsentimental way, is starting to back them up. And if the flood was real, if it wasn't just metaphor but a cultural memory of actual, world-changing catastrophe, then we're forced to ask a question most history books avoid. If they were telling the truth about that, what else might they be telling the truth about? So if the sky was one kind of memory, what about the other thing we all carry all the time without even thinking about it? Language. You can lose cities, coastlines, forests, entire ecosystems. But as long as people are still telling stories around fires, something survives. And when we finally find the first written versions of those stories, that's where the next anomaly appears. Let's go back to Sumerian. When cuneiform first shows up around 3500 BC, you'd expect it to look like a baby language awkwardly learning to walk. Messy spelling, inconsistent grammar, symbols used one way one day, a different way the next, confused scribes slowly figuring things out. That's not what we see. From the very beginning, Sumerian cuneiform is complex, systematic, and fully capable of handling abstract thought, law, astronomy, medicine, trade, ritual. Linguists have spent more than a century trying to answer a simple question. Okay, but what did Sumerian come from? Languages normally have families. You can trace French back to Latin, Latin back to Proto-Italic, and further to Proto-Indo-European. You can connect Hindi, Persian, Greek, English, Russian, and Spanish back to a shared ancestor. Sumerian? Nothing. No clear parent. No obvious cousins. No traceable baby Sumerian. Underneath the adult version we meet in those tablets, it just appears. Fully functional. Writing contracts. Cataloging stars. Recording legal disputes and medical prescriptions. It behaves less like a language that evolved in public, and more like a system that was already worked out somewhere else, then dropped into place and immediately put to use. Like the scribes weren't inventing it. They were remembering it. Egyptian hieroglyphics tell the same story in a different script. When they arrive around 3200 BC, they don't show up as a handful of stick figures and doodles that slowly morph into a writing system. They arrive with hundreds of distinct signs, phonetic components, semantic markers, grammar, syntax, and stylistic conventions, ready to write hymns, tax records, star lists, medical recipes, royal decrees, on day one. Where's proto-hieroglyphics? Where are the messy mistakes, the early beta versions, the half-finished experiments? We see a few scattered symbols on pottery and ceremonial objects, sure, but nothing like the long, visible ramp you'd expect leading up to a full-blown writing system. It's as if someone opened a box labeled language kit, complete, unpacked the signs, and started carving them into temple walls. And Egyptian priests were very clear about what they thought was going on. They said writing was a gift of Thoth, a divine inheritance, not a human invention. They said their temples were built according to a plan from the first time. They described themselves not as creators, but as restorers. Modern scholars shrug and go, ah yes, religious metaphor. Maybe. But notice how often that metaphor sounds like memory. Then you have the Indus Valley script. Around 2600 BC, in what's now Pakistan and northwest India, the Harappan civilization starts stamping seals with strange symbols. We found thousands of them. We still don't know what they mean. The script is consistent. The patterns repeat. The symbol order looks like it follows rules. It's not decorative. It's language, but like Sumerian and hieroglyphics, it doesn't show us baby steps. It appears in its mature form, and then disappears when the civilization collapses. No scribal practice tablets. No obvious evolution. No Proto-Indus to bridge the gap. Just another full-grown system that pops into the record like it came from somewhere else, and vanishes again before we can ask where. Even when we don't have the writing itself, we can feel the ghost of an older order in the way languages behave. Take Proto-Indo-European, the reconstructed ancestor of Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Old Norse, Old Persian, and most of the languages spoken across Europe and parts of Asia today. When linguists reverse engineer this ancestor, looking at all its daughters and asking what must the parent have sounded like, they find a language with words for agriculture, words for wheels, wagons, and yokes, words for domesticated animals, words for complex kinship structures. This wasn't a vocabulary born in scattered camps of wandering foragers. Whoever spoke Proto-Indo-European lived in organized societies with technology, social structure, and time to think about all of it. And just like before, you can feel the pattern. The deeper you go, the more it feels like you're walking into an older house that someone has already lived in, rearranged, repainted, and then abandoned. The furniture is still there. The layout still works. But whoever designed it, long gone. And then you get something even more blunt. The texts themselves say they're based on older writings. In Sumer, one cylinder inscription about building a temple to Inanna casually drops the line, "This is built according to the writings from before the flood." Not inspired by, not dedicated to, built according to, as in, we had instructions. In Egypt, temple inscriptions at places like Edfu and Dendera talk about blueprints from Zep Tepi, the first time being preserved and copied. They use phrases like, according to the plan that came down from the sky, copied from writings of the ancestors, rebuilt as it was in the beginning, not, we are geniuses who invented this. More like, we're doing our best to follow the manual someone left us. Imagine inheriting an old, half-burned engineering folder from your great-grandfather. You don't understand all the equations. You only recognize pieces. But you treat those pieces as sacred because you know they came from someone who knew more than you do. Now scale that feeling up to an entire priestly class. That's what these inscriptions sound like when you stand back and look at all of this together. The sky knowledge, the sudden appearance of writing, the fully formed languages, the temples that insist they're restorations, not inventions. You start to see a different picture of early civilization, not a clean upward curve, not cave, hut, village, city, smartphone. More like this, a long, deep, mostly hidden age where some culture or network of cultures mapped the sky, developed complex languages, designed architectural systems, and maybe even charted parts of the globe. A series of catastrophes, climate swings, floods, impact events that smashed that world, drowned its coasts, scattered its survivors. Generations of chaos where that knowledge degraded from engineering to ritual to story to myth. And then, slowly, in places like Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, Anatolia, people started building again. Not out of nothing, out of fragments, out of memories, out of that haunted feeling of, we used to know how to do this, we don't remember why it works, but we remember that it works. That's why the earliest writing systems feel like reinstalls instead of fresh installs. That's why priesthoods describe themselves as guardians of old plans. That's why temple inscriptions sound less like world building and more like world recovering. They weren't trying to create a brand new civilization. They were trying to reboot an old one with only part of the code. And if that's true, then all those strange details, those too precise star charts, those weirdly mature legal codes, those fully formed scripts with no baby pictures, they're not anomalies. They're fingerprints, left by a world we're only just starting to realize existed. And this brings us to the most unsettling part of all. Because if their languages were inherited, and their temples were restored, and their stars were remembered, then what about their warnings? What, exactly, were they so desperate to make sure we did not forget? The first time you really pay attention to these ancient records, it feels like they're telling you how the world began. But the second time, it feels like they're trying to tell you how it ends. Because once you accept that civilizations like Sumer and Egypt were rebuilding from fragments, you have to ask, what were they so terrified of losing that they carved it into stone, pressed it into clay, repeated it in rituals for thousands of years? The answer shows up everywhere. It's always the same. They were trying to make sure we never forgot that the world ends in cycles. Think about how strangely obsessed the ancients were with time. Not just days and months. Not just harvest seasons. Ages. The Sumerians had their king list. Pre-flood rulers with absurdly long reigns, then a disaster, then shorter and shorter reigns afterward. Egypt divided history into Zep Tepi, the first time, then the age of the gods, the followers of Horus, and finally human pharaohs. India divided time into yugas, vast world ages marching from golden to dark and back again. The Maya tracked cycles of creation and destruction with their long count calendar. Different cultures, same pattern. There was a time before something catastrophic happened. We live in the after. The cycle isn't random. It repeats. Flood myths weren't just about water. They were about a reset button. And the warnings aren't vague. They're specific. The Sumerian flood stories don't read like cozy bedtime metaphors. They read like survivor testimony. The storm raged 7 days and 7 nights. The waters rose over the people like an army. The gods themselves fled to the heavens like dogs crouching in corners. That's not how you talk about a symbolic lesson in good behavior. That's how you talk when your grandparents saw the shoreline vanish and never come back. It's the same in every culture. In Mesopotamia, the flood wipes away kingship and cities. In the Hebrew tradition, the flood erases all but a handful of people and a boat full of memory. In India, Manu survives in a vessel guided by a divine fish, carrying knowledge into the new age. In Mesoamerica, previous worlds end in jaguars, fire, wind, and flood, each reset stripping away whatever came before. What do all these stories have in common? Not just destruction, but continuity. There's always someone who remembers. Someone who carries forward seeds, animals, stories, measurements, names of stars. In other words, the ancients weren't just warning about disaster. They were warning about forgetting. Now here's where it gets unsettling. Once we had ice cores and sea level charts and sediment samples, we discovered that buried in all the myth and symbolism, the timing is right. Around 12,000 years ago, the climate jolts violently. Sea levels shoot up, coastlines drown, megafauna abruptly disappear, populations shift and collapse. Exactly the kind of planetary chaos you'd later compress into one unforgettable story. The gods drowned the world. We started over. So imagine you're a survivor culture a few thousand years later. You rebuilt some of what was lost. You reestablished farming, trade, temples, calendars. You're watching the sky again. You're tracking rivers, seasons, and stars. And then you start to realize the worst part. It wasn't a one-time freak accident. It was a pattern. That's the part almost everyone misses about these ancient records. They don't just say, once, long ago, there was a flood. They say, there was a flood. It came as part of a cycle. The cycle can come again. Here's how to know when you're close. Look at the way they talk about time. The Sumerians didn't just track years. They tracked long counts. 600-year cycles. 3,600-year cycles. And even longer, nested patterns tied to celestial motions. Egypt didn't just care about this year or this king. They built temples aligned to star positions that slowly drift with precession over thousands of years, almost like bookmarks pointing to epics. In India, the yugas lay out ages of rising and falling order, each with characteristic traits, each cycling in predictable sequence. When you zoom out, you see the same structure, a golden or order time, a slide into chaos, a catastrophic transition, a restart, repeat. Time isn't just linear, it's looped. And that looping isn't just spiritual. Sometimes it's written out with eerie precision. The Sumerian king list doesn't just say, before the flood was long, after was short. It gives exact durations. The Yuga system doesn't just say, ages repeat. It assigns them numerical lengths. Maya calendrics don't just record days. They anchor events across tens of thousands of years. Are the numbers literal? Maybe not. But the insistence on measured cycles matters. Because you only obsess over tracking cycles if someone, somewhere, has already learned the hard way what happens when one hits you off guard. Imagine a civilization noticing that every so many centuries, there is widespread famine, strange sky phenomena, climate swings, social collapse. You might not understand orbital mechanics, but you'd understand pattern. And once you saw that pattern, you'd do exactly what they did. Embed it in religion, hide it in myths, carve into stone, train entire priesthoods whose job is to keep count, so that even if everything else fails, the warning survives. Listen to the way their stories talk about memory. The kingship descended from heaven again after the flood. This temple is built according to the writings from before. These measures are copied from the ancestors. This knowledge was given in the first time. They're obsessed with linking now to a shattered before. They're terrified of a world where that link breaks. Because if the cycle comes around again and nobody remembers what happened last time, that's not just bad luck. That's extinction. Now, bring it forward to us. We live in a world where we know about ice ages. We know about asteroid impacts. We know sea levels can swing hundreds of feet. We know climate can flip in decades, not just millennia. We have satellites watching the sky. We have sensors in the oceans. We have climate models running on supercomputers. But how do we treat that knowledge? As background noise, as something for documentaries and science articles, and the occasional panic headline. We don't live like a species that remembers it has already come to the brink more than once. We live like it's all basically stable, unless we personally see it fall apart. The ancients didn't have that luxury. Their grandparents actually watched rivers rise and never go back. Their ancestors saw animals vanish from the world. Their oldest stories came from people who watched the sky do something it had never done before. So they built cultures around never letting that memory die. calendars as warning systems, myths as data storage, temples as three-dimensional notebooks, priests as human hard drives. We turned their warnings into mythology classes. They meant them as instructions. And here's the part that lingers, long after you close the history books. What if they didn't just want us to remember the past? What if they were trying to warn whoever lived in the next dangerous window? What if all those obsessively kept counts, those long cycles, those strange ages and pre-flood king lists weren't just nostalgia, but timers? Not for them. For us. Because if a previous world rose to knowledge, lost it in catastrophe, clawed its way back, and then left its last scraps of memory in clay and stone, and we are the ones who finally learn to decode those scraps, then we're not just reading ancient history. We're reading what survivors wanted us to know about the next time the cycle turns. So if all of this really is a message in a bottle, what were they trying to tell us about the next wave? Not in terms of dates circled on a calendar, or doom headlines about a specific year. Ancient people didn't think like that. Their lives were too short. Their scale was different. They thought in patterns. Flood, recovery, forgetting. Flood, recovery, forgetting. Ages of growth, followed by ages of collapse. Moments where the graph of history doesn't slope gently. It breaks. And that's the uncomfortable part nobody likes to sit with. We're not living in a straight line. We're surfing the top of a curve we don't fully understand. From our perspective, history is a smooth, upward climb. Stone tools, bronze, iron, steam, electricity, internet, AI. We tell the story like a staircase, always up, always forward. But from the perspective of those clay tablets in drowned cities, it looks more like this. Unknown age, catastrophe, rebuilding. Sumer and Egypt, local collapses, rebuilding. Bronze Age world, 3,200-year event, Dark Ages, rebuilding. Us? We're very good at telling ourselves we're unique. We're the first to do this. The first to reach this level. The first to truly understand. The Sumerians thought that too. So did the Egyptians. So did the Maya. So did the late Bronze Age cultures that traded across the Mediterranean like it was one big lake, and then vanished so hard we only found their story again a few centuries ago. Every civilization believes it's the final draft. Every civilization is just one version. Think about how fragile our knowledge actually is. The Sumerians baked warnings into clay. Some of those tablets have survived 5,000 plus years of heat, war, looting, empire after empire. If you knock your phone off the counter and crack the screen, you might lose half your life. Our science lives on. Magnetic disks that demagnetize. Servers that need constant cooling. Cables that corrode. Satellites zipping through belts of radiation. Pull the plug on the power grid, and within a decade, most of what we know exists only as ruins and memories. No one's reading PDFs 5,000 years from now. Clay survives. Silicon does not. It's almost funny in a dark way. The Sumerians, with their reed styluses and river mud, accidentally built a storage medium more durable than our data centers. We made everything faster. They made a few things last. And this is where you and I slip into the picture, not as neutral observers, but as part of the story. Because if the ancients were desperately trying to stop a second forgetting, then we are the ones standing at the fork in the road. We're the first generation to read ice cores and Sumerian tablets at the same time, map the ocean floor and the drowned river valleys below it, model climate flips on supercomputers, and then look up and see myths describing the same thing. We have the tools to understand what they were shouting from across 6,000 years. We also have infinite distraction in our pockets, feeds tuned to keep us scrolling, not remembering, attention spans that barely survive a 60-second clip. Imagine telling a Sumerian priest, yes, we can see asteroid before they hit. Yes, we know the seas can rise 400 feet. Yes, we understand climate can flip in decades. No, we don't really plan more than about 4 years ahead. They would think we were insane. Now, I'm not saying there's a calendar in some museum with a red circle around a future year labeled World Ends. Do not Mississippi. That's not how any of this works. The cycles the ancients tracked weren't simple countdowns. They were risk windows. Times when multiple dangers line up. Climate instability, resource strain, celestial hazards, social fragmentation. You don't need an asteroid to wipe a civilization. You just need enough overlapping stress that the system can't rebalance in time. We know scientifically that impact events cluster, not random. Climate can lurch, not glide. Societies can unravel shockingly fast once certain thresholds are crossed. The ancients didn't code words like nonlinear dynamics or complex systems. They had stories. The gods turned away. The sky betrayed us. The world before was swallowed. Different vocabulary. Same phenomenon. So what were they actually asking us to do? Build more pyramids? Worship the stars? No. If you strip away the imagery, the message under everything they carved is surprisingly simple. Know that the world can change faster than you think. Don't assume your moment is permanent. Carry knowledge across the break. That last one might be the most important, because in the end, even the most advanced civilization is just people trying to pass things forward. How to grow food when the climate shifts, where the coast used to be, which celestial patterns mean danger, which mistakes cost too much to repeat. The Sumerians did their part with clay and ritual and song. The Egyptians with stone and geometry. The Maya with calendars carved into rock. Us, we have something they never did. Global reach. A story told in one place can echo everywhere in ours. A single video can carry a warning to millions of people in dozens of countries in the middle of the night while they're half asleep and scrolling. Exactly like you right now. So what do we do with that? I'm not going to tell you to panic or build a bunker or start counting years on some secret chart. That's not the point of this story. The point is to remember that we are not the first humans to stand at this edge, looking back into a past full of ruins and forward into an unknown future. We're part of a chain. Someone before the flood learned hard lessons. Someone after the flood tried not to let those lessons vanish. Priests, scribes, stone carvers, map makers kept carrying fragments. Archaeologists dug them up, and now they're in your headphones. The question isn't, is another catastrophe coming tomorrow? The question is, when the next big test comes, whatever shape it takes, will we have done a better job of remembering than they did? Will our knowledge be stored in a way that survives power cuts and server fires and broken networks? Will we teach our children that the world can flip and that they're smart enough to adapt? Will we build systems designed to endure centuries, not just quarterly profits? Those answers aren't written on tablets. They're written in choices. Ours. Because here's the quiet twist at the end. Those people who pressed their fingertips into wet clay under a Mesopotamian moon had no idea if anyone would ever read what they were writing. They just knew they had to try. We're on the receiving end of their gamble. Their warnings made it. Their memories survived the water, the fire, the collapsing cities, the forgetting. Now the story is in our hands. And maybe the real test of whether we've understood it isn't how fascinated we are by ancient mysteries. It's whether we're willing to become, for someone thousands of years from now, what those Sumerian scribes became for us. A faint, stubborn voice in the ruins, whispering, "We were here. We learned. We tried to warn you. Don't let it happen the same way again." If that thought sits heavy on your chest, you're not alone. When you first realize that we're probably not the first version of advanced humanity, your brain does this little lurch. Because suddenly our skyscrapers, satellites, and streaming platforms don't feel like a final destination anymore. They feel like one more layer in the sediment, one more chapter that could close. Here's something to think about the next time you walk through a city at night. Look around. Glass towers lit up like constellations. Cars flowing like metal rivers. Planes gliding soundlessly overhead. Signals bouncing between cell towers and satellites. Now, mentally turn off the electricity. No backup generators. No emergency grid. Just dark. No elevators. No traffic lights. No ATMs. No internet. No refrigeration. How long before this whole system, this vast, humming organism we call modern civilization, starts to unravel? Within hours. Panic at gas stations, airports, hospitals. Within days, food supply chains begin to fail. Within weeks, cities become unlivable without constant logistics. Within months, everything starts looking a lot less like the future and a lot more like whatever you can carry. Now, stretch that scenario out, not as a permanent blackout, but as a repeating pattern of disruptions. Floods here, fires there, crops failing 3 years in a row, supply chain stressed, nations pointing fingers, trust evaporating. You don't need a single huge asteroid to reset a world like that. You just need enough overlapping shocks. The ancients didn't have global supply chains. Their world was smaller, slower, but they didn't know what happens when the rivers don't behave, the sky stops following the normal rules, harvests fail over and over, people move in waves, hungry and desperate. They watched whole cultures blink out. They survived some of those collapses. They didn't survive others. And the ones who did survive carved the same message into every medium they had. Don't assume it can't happen again. One of the strangest parts of our moment in history is this. We're more powerful than any civilization that's ever existed. And in some ways, we're more fragile. The Sumerians depended on rainfall patterns, river floods, nearby fields, local storage. We depend on microchips made in a handful of factories, rare earth metals mined in a few specific regions, internet infrastructure threaded across oceans, satellites whizzing overhead at thousands of miles per hour. A single failure in their system meant famine here. A cascading failure in our system can mean chaos everywhere. And at the same time, we're the first humans with the tools to track asteroids across the sky, monitor the atmosphere in real time, simulate climate patterns decades in advance, detect tiny variations in the Earth's magnetic field, sea level, and temperature. We can see the wave coming in a way no Sumerian priest ever could. The question is not capability. It's attention. We don't lack data. We lack focus. The clay tablets didn't survive because someone went viral. They survived because someone said, "This matters enough to carve into something that can't be erased by one bad season." They chose stone and fire clay for a reason. Ask yourself, if you wanted to send one piece of knowledge 5,000 years into the future, would you trust a tweet, a video platform, a thumb drive in a drawer, a server farm on a floodplain? Or would you carve it into something that doesn't care who's in power, who's trending, or whether subscription got canceled? It's easy to laugh at stone monuments. It's harder to admit that long-term stone monuments laugh at us. Our world is optimized for speed, not persistence. Fast news, fast trends, fast outrage, fast forgetting. We can stream a million things we'll never remember and ignore the handful of things that might determine whether we get remembered. But here's the hopeful part, buried under all the unease. Remembering is contagious. The same algorithms that feed you cat videos at 3 a.m. can also carry stories like this one out to people who've never thought about Sumer, or ice cores, or flood layers in a rock. You don't have to become an archaeologist, or a climate scientist, or an astronomer. You just have to be one more person on Earth who knows that the timeline is longer than the last 200 years, that other civilizations reached high and fell hard, that floods and fires and sky stones are not just old world superstition, that someone tried very hard to write warnings through time. Because cultures shift when enough individuals quietly change what they take for granted. When enough people move from, "Nothing like that could ever happen here," to, "It has happened, it can happen." So what do we do differently? Maybe doing differently starts small, not with saving the world, with refusing to forget the pattern. When you hear about a once-in-a-thousand-year flood that's happened 3 times in a decade, the old story should echo when a heat wave breaks records every summer. You should think of the tablets that mention the year the winds burned but no rain came. When scientists talk about sea levels rising, coast shifting, food production moving, you should remember that between 12,000 and 6,000 BC, entire continental shelves drowned. And the only reason we know is because a few survivors refused to let the memory die. We're not helpless spectators in all this. We're exactly what the Sumerians were gambling on. Future minds with better tools and a wider view. Maybe the real task is this simple. Learn the deeper timeline, not just your nation's history, but Earth's history. See yourself not as modern, but as part of a chain. Ask with uncomfortable honesty, if everything we know had to pass through a bottleneck, what would actually survive? Because bottlenecks happen. Sometimes it's fire. Sometimes it's water. Sometimes it's silence. And if that sounds dramatic, remember, for most of human existence, our species has already been through multiple near misses. Somebody kept the thread alive, long enough for clay tablets to reach a museum, long enough for frozen air bubbles in Greenland to be drilled and read, long enough for you to be sitting here hearing all of this in your language, on your device, in your time. Ancient scribes did their part. They pressed warnings into mud. They aligned temples with dangerous stars. They encoded memories into stories that could survive countless retellings. Now, weirdly, the relay baton is in our hands. Not because we're special, because we're next. So as you close this video, turn off the screen and step back into your own life. Let this thought hang in the doorway for a moment. Our ancestors weren't just trying to explain where they came from. They were trying to make sure someone, someday, would understand why their world ended, and how ours might, too. Not so we'd be afraid, so we'd be ready. If we are, as it appears, the first civilization with both the warning and the technology, then maybe, for the first time in the long, broken memory of our species, the story doesn't have to end the same way. So, what do we do with a realization like that? Because it's one thing to say, hey, maybe civilization resets sometimes. It's another to look at your phone, your ceiling, your life, and ask yourself, what if this is the version of the story that finally learns? Not because we're smarter, but because we're the first ones who can see the whole board. We can map the sky in real time. We can drill into ice from 100,000 years ago. We can simulate climate shifts on supercomputers. We can watch the Earth breathe from orbit. The Sumerians had torches and clay. We have satellites and particle accelerators. And yet, in one very specific, unsettling way, we might actually be more similar to them than we want to admit. They lived at the beginning of a danger window they only dimly understood. We might be living in one we've only just rediscovered. Here's where the story threads start tightening together. Ancient texts talk about the star of crossing, stones of fire, the bull of heaven, seasons of dust, the year when the sky burned without clouds. For most of modern history, we filed all that under poetry, religion, pre-scientific imagination. Then we discovered the Taurid meteor stream, a debris trail Earth passes through twice a year. The likelihood that a giant comet fragmented tens of thousands of years ago. The probability that this debris has caused repeated impacts and air bursts. The pattern that big events tend to cluster in time, not spread evenly. Suddenly, those old phrases started sounding a lot less poetic and a lot more like field notes. The Sumerians obsessively watched the region of the sky we now associate with Taurus and the Pleiades, which just happens to be where the Taurid stream's radiance sits. They track cycles of 1 year, seasons of heightened risk, 600-ish years, minor intensifications, 3,600 years, major cycles, when things get especially dicey. Modern models of the Taurid stream, they show density variations, gravitational nudges, and risk peaks that line up very uncomfortably close to those same time frames. Did the Sumerians know about orbital mechanics? Probably not in equations. But did they know, every so many lifetimes, the sky gets meaner? Yes, because they'd kept the receipts. Fast forward to now. We like to think we've outgrown sky gods and omens. We don't climb ziggurats to scan the horizon. Instead, we launch telescopes, run all sky surveys, catalog near-Earth objects, build risk models. And in 2022, quietly, NASA's planetary defense folks updated their long-term outlook and basically said, hey, by the way, between about 2030 and 2040, we're passing through a denser chunk of the Taurid complex than we've seen in a very long time. Not we're doomed. Not the end is nigh. Just risk rises here. Might want to pay attention. If you overlay that with those ancient 3,600-year counts, with their warnings about the return of the fiery stones, The crossing star in the season when light dies early, the time when the count is fulfilled, you get this weird, shivery feeling. Because it means two totally different civilizations using totally different methods across 5,000 years of separation may have independently pointed to the same general time period. Ours. Let's be clear so this doesn't spiral into fear-mongering. We are not talking about a guaranteed end-of-the-world rock. We're talking about odds. Ancient priests watching the dawn sky, modern astronomers watching data streams, both saying in their own language, there are stretches of time when the dice are loaded, and we're walking into one of those stretches with cities that glow so bright you can see them from orbit, power grids that can cascade collapse, and a global food system that depends on predictable weather. It's not about panic. It's about context. The Sumerians responded to their context by building temples that doubled as observatories, creating classes of priests whose primary job was watching, encoding danger seasons into rituals so they'd never be skipped, carving patterns into clay so they couldn't be easily lost. We respond to ours by doom scrolling, arguing in comment sections, and binging apocalypse movies while real risk reports crawl by at the bottom of news feeds. One approach is obviously more dramatic. The other is more useful. Here's the catch though. We actually do have our own version of ziggurat priests. They're just not wearing robes. They're the astronomers who map near-Earth objects, the climate scientists reading ice and sediment, the engineers designing deflection missions, the data nerds building risk models and early warning systems. They're the ones sitting on modern mountaintops with telescopes instead of stone platforms with sighting stones. They write papers instead of omens. They publish in journals instead of pressing clay. And just like the Sumerian scribes, they know something most people don't think about day to day. Low probability, high impact events are only unthinkable until they happen in your lifetime. So what's our role in that? We're not all going to go learn orbital mechanics after this video, but each of us can decide whether we treat these warnings, ancient and modern, as background noise, or as something worth folding into how we think about the future. Let's bring this home, because it's very easy to drift into abstraction. Picture two futures. Future one, we ignore all of this. We keep treating disasters like surprises. We underfund monitoring. We roll our eyes at space rocks. We keep building fragile systems on fragile coasts. We assume our version of civilization is too advanced to really fall. If a big enough object ever does arrive unannounced, or if enough smaller shocks stack up in a short window, we become another layer in the archaeological record, a mysterious technological culture that appeared suddenly and vanished, just like the ones we've been talking about. Future 2, we actually listen. We treat planetary defense, resilient infrastructure, and climate stability as boring, baseline responsibilities. We keep improving sky surveys, build serious deflection capabilities, design cities and systems that can take hits and keep going, document our knowledge in ways that can survive more than just a digital hiccup. In that future, if something big ever does come at us, we'll see it early, we'll nudge it away, or we'll move what we have to move, or we'll band together to survive the impact and rebuild. Not from zero, but from a place of preparation, and that would be new, because as far as we can tell, no previous civilization ever got that far. They saw enough to warn. They just didn't live long enough to act on the scale we can. So where do you fit in this giant, unnerving picture? Maybe here. You're one more person who knows that deep time is real. You're one more person who doesn't roll their eyes at old myths. You're one more person who understands that rare doesn't mean never. When conversations come up about climate or asteroids or resilience, you'll be carrying this whole buried timeline in the back of your mind. You'll know we're not just doing this for ourselves. We're doing it for whoever might come after us, or for the first version of humanity that doesn't have to crawl out of the rubble again. That sounds grandiose, but honestly, it might be the most down-to-earth thing we've ever done. So tonight, when you step outside, if you can see the stars where you live, look up for a moment. Find Orion if you can. Find Taurus. Find the Pleiades. That little ghostly cluster the Sumerians watched like a threat. You're looking at the same sky they did. You're standing on a world that's already rebooted more than once. And you're part of the first generation that can actually choose whether the next chapter is another amnesia or the beginning of something that finally remembers. If you want more deep dives into places where myth, science, and buried history overlap, you know what to do. Hit subscribe. Drop a comment with what part of this hit you hardest. And tell me where you're watching from. Because somewhere out there, across all these time zones and screens, we're quietly doing something our ancestors prayed for. We're finally reading the warnings they left. The only question now is what we decide to do with them. If you're still here, if your mind is doing that quiet spinning thing, where part of you wants to dismiss all of this as just a story, and another part of you can't quite walk away, then you're exactly the kind of person the ancients were writing for. Not the kings, not the priests, not the people who were too busy staying in power to think about time. They were writing for the ones who stayed up too late, stared too long at the horizon, and asked questions nobody really wanted answers to. People like you. So let's sit with one last idea. We spent this whole video talking about civilizations. Sumer, Egypt, the builders of Göbekli Tepe, the unknown coastal cultures now lying under 400 feet of water. We've talked about them as if they were big, distant things. But in reality, they were just stacks of human lives. Someone in Eridu was the last person to lock the temple door before the flood layer Wooly found. Someone was the first to look at a half-submerged village and realize, oh, the world we were told about? The one with the great kings and long lives? That isn't coming back, is it? Someone chiseled the first line of the king list and thought, I don't know how long Alulem really ruled, but I know there was a before that we're losing. Someone in Egypt watched priests talk about Zep-Tepi the first time and realized they were describing a world that sounded more like science fiction than religion. And someone in Sumer sat in a lamplit room, pressed a reed into clay and wrote, after the flood swept over. That person didn't know you would ever exist. Didn't know there would one day be screens, headphones, Wi-Fi, or a stranger listening in another language 6,000 years later. They just knew, if I don't write this down, it dies with us. That's the strange, quiet pressure sitting under all of this. Because like it or not, we are now those people. We're the ones living at a hinge point. We're the ones that future archaeologists, if there are future archaeologists, will dig up and argue about. They'll look at our ruins and say, how do they have so much power and still manage to be so fragile? They'll find our skyscrapers, our plastic layers in the sediment, our satellite junk in orbit, our half-decayed data centers under floodplains, and maybe, if we're lucky, some archive we actually designed to last. They'll argue about whether we deserve to fall, just like we argue about the Maya or Rome or the Akkadians. And somewhere in that future, someone will find one of our recordings, a server backup, a fossilized hard drive, an etched disk in some forgotten vault, maybe even a video like this. And they'll see you, not your face, not your name, but your presence, a watch count, a comment, a timestamp, evidence that someone, on some night, cared enough to sit with uncomfortable ideas instead of numbing out. We romanticize ancient wisdom a lot. We say things like, the ancients knew things we didn't. They were closer to the stars. They were more spiritual, more connected. Maybe that's true in some ways. But they also knew hunger, fear, confusion, the feeling of watching everything familiar fall apart and having no idea what comes next. On that level, they weren't different from us at all. They just had fewer distractions. When the sky burned, they didn't have a notification to check. They had to either look away or look up. So here's my invitation to you, if this video stuck with you. Don't let this just be an interesting story you mentally file under cool conspiracy-adjacent history. And forget, let it change the scale you think on. Let it do at least one of these. Make you a little more patient with long-term problems. Make you a little less cynical about big, boring things like infrastructure, science funding, and boring committees with unsexy names. Make you a little more curious when you hear myth, instead of assuming it's just decoration. And maybe quietly, let it reframe what legacy means. Not money, not fame, not followers. But this, did I help my slice of humanity leave the next one a better map than the one we got? That might mean working on actual planetary defense or climate resilience, or teaching people how to think clearly, or archiving knowledge in creative ways, or just being one more person who doesn't sneer at the idea of preparing for rare but real risks. Most of us won't be Sumerian scribes or Egyptian architects of our age. We'll be background characters. But background characters still carry the story. They're the ones who decide which warnings get laughed at and which ones get taken seriously. And if all of this feels a little too overwhelming, here's a simple way to hold it. Think of humanity as someone learning to walk on ice. We've slipped before. We've gone under before. We had to crawl back out, soaking and half-frozen, with memory clinging like wet clothes. This time around, we've got tools, data, satellites, math. We can see the cracks forming before we step on them, if we choose to look. The ancients are basically shouting from the other side of time. We fell through here, and here, and here. Please don't pretend the ice is unbreakable. Whether we listen is on us. If you want to keep going down this rabbit hole into other forgotten timelines, other buried warnings, other places where mythology and geology secretly agree, you know what to do. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. Comment with the one idea from this story that won't leave your head. And tell me which ancient culture you want to explore next. The builders of Göbekli Tepe, the Indus Valley cities, or the lost coastal worlds now lying under the sea. Somewhere long ago, a tired scribe in a mud brick room pressed a reed into wet clay and thought. I don't know who will read this, but I hope someone does. Tonight, we kept their promise. The rest, the remembering, the preparing, the acting, is up to us. If the ancients were trying to warn us, then maybe the real horror isn't what happened to them. It's how easily the same thing could happen to us. Not with the same floods or the same sky, but with the same pattern. We get comfortable. We start thinking of ourselves as a main event, not one chapter. We mistake momentum for immortality. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the world, someone is trying to write a warning that nobody wants to read. Let's do something kind of uncomfortable. Zoom out from the myths, from the temples, from the ice cores and tablets. And look at us. Right now, we are a civilization that can map near-Earth asteroids in 3D, can simulate climate change centuries into the future, can detect gravitational waves from colliding black holes, and yet argues about whether long-term risks are real enough to care about. We are, in other words, a species that knows how to see danger coming, but still behaves like nothing truly bad can happen to us. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly how a lot of late-stage civilizations we study looked right before everything snapped. The Akkadians didn't think their empire could just stop. The classic Maya didn't think their cities would turn silent. The people of Doggerland probably didn't think their homeland would vanish beneath the waves within a few generations. No one ever thinks they're living inside the chapter called Things Fell Apart. Not until after. The Sumerians had a phrase buried in their text that hits a little too hard when you read it with modern eyes. After the kingship was lowered again. Not created, not invented, lowered again, like a program being rebooted. And what do you do after a reboot? You try to remember which systems were running. Which files did we lose? What do we have to reinstall from scratch? That's what the first post-flood civilizations were doing. Sumer wasn't a startup. Sumer was a recovery operation. Egypt wasn't a blank slate. It was a restore from backup. Göbekli Tepe wasn't a prototype. It was a memorial and a machine, part ritual, part archive. Now here's the part nobody likes to say out loud. We might be somebodies. Again, too. Not because of some guaranteed doom prophecy. Not because Nibiru is coming or the universe hates us. But because complex systems are fragile. And we are building more complexity, more tightly linked on a planet that occasionally shrugs. Asteroids, volcanoes, climate tipping points, pandemics, self-inflicted disasters we haven't even invented yet. We're not living on a stable stage. We're surfing a moving plate. So what does it actually mean to take ancient warnings seriously? Not symbolically, not as spiritual metaphors. But practically, it doesn't mean panic, doomsday prepping in a bunker, or deciding everything is pointless. If anything, it's the opposite. Taking the ancient record seriously means recognizing that we are part of a chain, and then asking, can we be the first link in that chain that doesn't let everything snap? That might look like supporting boring, unsexy things like asteroid detection, planetary defense, and long-term archives. Actually investing in climate resilience, not just climate slogans. Designing infrastructure that can survive more than one kind of disaster. Creating ways to store knowledge that don't vanish if power grids go silent for a while. And on a very personal level, it looks like refusing to treat the future as someone else's problem. The Sumerian scribe pressing clay transitions into us pressing keys. Same impulse, same hope. Let this survive us. There's a concept in information science called the digital dark age. It's the idea that one day, huge chunks of our era could become unreadable because file formats, hardware, and software all moved on. Imagine some future researcher excavating a data center from the 21st century. Racks of servers, millions of drives, all perfectly preserved, and completely inaccessible without the right tools. That's almost exactly what we're doing with ancient tablets and inscriptions. We have fragments of their astronomy, fragments of their myths, fragments of their geometry, and we're reconstructing a shattered mirror from a few glittering shards. Now flip it. What fragment of our world would actually survive? Probably not your favorite app. Probably not your streaming subscriptions. Probably not most of what we think of as our culture, but maybe stone, glass, and metal structures, etched discs archives, or time capsules. A small fraction of books, carved monuments, and engravings, and whatever stories people still tell after everything else has been torn up. That's why the way we frame our own time matters. If our myths are only about individual hustle, personal success, short-term drama, then that's the version of us that survives. A civilization that thought in 3-month quarters, standing on a planet that moves in million-year cycles. Earlier civilizations built in stone because they didn't have a choice. We build in code and concrete because it's fast. But every once in a while, we still reach for something heavier. We build long-term vaults in mountains, seed banks in the Arctic, gold-plated records attached to spacecraft, archives buried deep underground. Those are the moments when we unconsciously slip back into Sumerian mode, thinking in centuries, not scroll depth, thinking like people who know things fall down. If there's one thing to steal from the ancients, it's that mindset, not their exact myths, not their exact fears, but their refusal to let memory die quietly. They turn floods into stories, stories into rituals, rituals into temples, temples into stone. We turn warnings into posts, posts into noise, unless we decide otherwise. So, if you watched all the way to this point, here's a tiny, almost invisible way to step into that long chain of memory. Leave your own tablet behind. Not literally clay, unless you're into pottery, in which case, go wild. I mean, write down the stories your family doesn't want to forget. Save the things you wish someone had saved for you. Support the science and archives that feel too long-term to matter. Think about how your work, whatever it is, might ripple 50 or 100 years from now. That may sound small, but so did one person carving after the flood swept over into wet clay. They didn't know they were speaking to us. You don't know who you're speaking to either. If this video shook something loose in you, that feeling that history is less a straight line and more like a heart rate with spikes and flat lines, then you're exactly the kind of person I want to keep talking to. So, subscribe if you want more deep dives into the cracks of history. Comment with the one idea that stuck. The flood, the forgotten languages, the buried observatories, or the possibility that we're not the first round of civilized humans on this planet. And let me know which thread we should follow next. Submerged cities, lost star maps, or the question nobody really wants to ask. What a future archaeology of our world might look like. For now, wherever you are, on a bright morning commute or lying awake in the dark, remember this. Somewhere under the ocean, under miles of water and time. There are stones carved by hands who also thought the world they knew would last forever. It didn't. Ours won't either. But what we choose to remember, and what we choose to leave behind, that part is still in our hands. Maybe, somewhere far in the future, someone will be sitting in a quiet room, holding a piece of our world in their hands the way we hold Sumerian clay. Not a tablet this time, but maybe a shard of etched metal, a fragment of glass with strange patterns burned into it, a slice of silicon fused with microscopic pathways. They won't know what Wi-Fi was. They won't know what a cloud server meant. They might not even know what language we spoke. But they'll see the same thing we saw when we first read the king lists and flood myths. A civilization that seemed to arrive suddenly, technically sophisticated, everywhere at once, and then gone. Picture this. They dig down to the layers of our era, the same way we dig down through UR, Kish, and Shurapak. They find concrete towers with steel ribs, plastic fragments in compressed layers of soil, thin slivers of gold foil and strange etched discs, carbon burn marks from fires we couldn't control, maybe even the scar of a crater we didn't see coming in time. They analyze our atmosphere in trapped bubbles of ice, the way we did to theirs. They see a spike in greenhouse gases, sudden temperature changes, elevated traces of industrial chemicals, radioactive particles from peaceful energy and not-so-peaceful weapons. They look at that, then at the ruins of megacities, and they'll ask the same question we asked Sumer. How did they not see it coming? They'll find our myths too, not in stone, but in whatever still clings to permanent media. Bits of film buried in salt mines, a preserved server farm in a collapsed building, discs from a time capsule labeled, "Do not open until the year nobody kept track of." And when they figure out how to view them, they won't start with our science. They'll start with our stories. End-of-the-world movies, disaster shows, clickable apocalypse thumbnails, dystopian novels, collapsing city CGI. And they're going to notice something eerie. Just like us reading flood myths, they'll see that we did imagine the worst. We told ourselves over and over again how fragile things were. We just didn't take ourselves seriously. Think about how we treat ancient people. We say, well, of course they dramatized floods. Of course they exaggerated lifespans. Of course they over-mythologized their past. Now flip that around. Imagine future researchers looking at our records and saying, of course they thought they were the pinnacle. Of course they thought everything before them was primitive. Of course they believed collapse was something that happened to other people. They might see our age the way we see the age after flood. A reboot phase, a recovery era that thought it was a beginning because it had forgotten what came before. But here's the twist. We don't have to be. Unlike those ancient scribes, we have something they never did. Space telescopes. Planetary defense programs, barely funded but real. Global communication that can spread a warning in seconds. Science that can map long-term risks before they hit. We still make the same mistakes they did: ego, denial, short-term thinking. But we also have the tools to do something they could only dream about. Break the cycle on purpose. Not by conquering nature. Not by pretending nothing bad can happen. But by admitting that we aren't the first. And then acting like a generation that understands what being in the middle of the story really means. If you've stayed with this video to this point, you're already a bit different from the average scroll. Most people tap out as soon as the timeline gets uncomfortable. But you didn't. You sat with the idea that our history is built on top of someone else's ending. The possibility that we misinterpret ancient warnings as myths. The chance that we are the ones being written to from 6,000 years ago. So here's the uncomfortable but empowering part. You personally are now part of the chain. You can't unknow any of this. You can ignore it. You can joke about it. You can move on and binge something lighter after this. But somewhere inside, that little voice that says we've been here before is not going away. That's your scribe, your inner tablet maker, the part of you that wants what you know to outlive what you are. If there's another civilization after ours digging to the rubble of our world, I hope they find at least a few things that make them pause and say, they weren't completely asleep. Some of them tried. Maybe they'll find evidence of global cooperation to deflect dangerous objects, long-term archives storing our knowledge in ways that survive power loss, cities redesigned to live with the planet instead of against it, structures built not for 20 years, but for 200. They'll still see our mistakes, our blind spots, our arrogance. But if we're lucky, they'll also see this, that at least some of us knew we were standing on the shoulders of a drowned world, that some of us took the ancient warnings seriously, not as prophecy, but as precedent. So what do you do with all of this when the video ends and the algorithm offers you the next distraction? Honestly, you don't need to overhaul your whole life overnight. You don't have to become a hermit or a prophet or a full-time doom researcher. You can start small. Stay curious about long-term risks instead of tuning them out. Support people and projects working on planetary scale safety. Think in decades when everyone else thinks in days. Tell younger people the kind of stories you wish someone had told you, not just about how things are, but how fragile they really are. That might feel insignificant. It's not. Civilizations are not moved by one giant heroic act. They're shifted slowly by millions of tiny choices that add up over time. The people who built Göbekli Tepe weren't thinking about YouTube. They were just trying to remember. You can do the same in your own way with the tools of your time. I'll leave you with this. Somewhere a long time ago, a scribe in a flickering lamplight pressed a final line into wet clay after the flood swept over. They didn't know who would read it, or when, or if anyone would care. They just knew someone might. Right now, you're that someone. And one day, someone else might be sitting where you are now, watching a fragment of our world and wondering if we saw what was coming. If you want to be there for more of these deep, uncomfortable, puzzle piece videos about the parts of history we're not supposed to think about too hard, you know what to do. Hit subscribe. Drop a comment with the one idea you can't shake. And share this with someone who likes their history with a side of existential dread and wonder. Because in the end, civilizations rise, civilizations fall, coastlines drown, languages vanish. But one thing keeps coming back. The human need to reach into the future and whisper to whoever's listening. We were here. We knew something. Don't make our mistakes.